We are continuing to think about how we can identify and develop our own ideas about possible messages or thematic statements in the fiction that we read. And today's lesson is a pretty important one. We're going to be practicing the skill of paying close attention to the interesting things that writers do to often subtly add layers of meaning to their work. So, and we can call these moves of author's craft or craft moves or techniques, or we can talk about the use of literary devices. Um, what's important is that you are learning how to pay attention to that craft. Look for those purposeful moves that the author is using. Think about how those techniques, how those strategies, how those author's craft moves can help us to see more about what the possible message or theme of the story is. Now, we're going to start off by talking about a few specific literary devices. When we talk about literary devices, those are just the specific tools that writers have at their disposal. Some of you may know them by name or some of them by name, and some of you might not, even though they will be familiar to you. But what's important to me is that you start to learn how to do your best to just recognize when the author might be doing some kind of special work to enhance the story. So sometimes when we talk about literary devices, we're thinking more at like the structural level, right? The way they're organizing their story. So if you're noticing some flashbacks that are interrupting the narrative, that is often something to pay attention to, right? In our notice and note, we sometimes talk about those as being memory moments, right? And when we're talking about signposts, and foreshadowing is kind of the reverse of that, right? Hinting at what is to come in the story. There's oftentimes lots of comparisons. Some of them are very specific, like similes. That's a type of metaphor that compares something using like or as, or metaphors, which also make comparisons that are not always as direct. There is repetition. Again, thinking about our signposts, that could be again and again, or an again and again moment. But I'm also want you to be looking at kind of like parallel sentences. So the way an author repeats the way she phrases something within a short section. So you're kind of looking at structure of sentences there. There's symbolism, which in my mind is kind of like a comparison, kind of like a metaphor on its own. But here it's where an object or a color or an idea or and so forth gets repeated a few times in a story and starts to take on some sort of extra significance. So it's a little bit like a comparison. It's often a kind of an again and again, but it's definitely worth paying attention to. Sometimes just the use of descriptive words or sentences counts as a specific kind of literary device, bringing in really rich or vivid imagery. Personification, which I think some of you guys know, when things that are non-human take on human-like characteristics. Hyperbole, which is a great one, which is it just means like extreme kind of exaggeration. But even just sentence variety, we will notice this a lot when we're looking at All Summer in a Day, the way Ray Bradbury constructs his sentences, and pay attention if a a noticeable series of short or long or choppy or complex or incomplete sentences occur. And if they start to feel important or significant to you, then you should pay attention to them. And there are lots of other literary devices besides the one I've put here. But as I talked about before, I think when we were reading How to Transform a Hoop Court, it is good, obviously, as a student of literature and student of English, to it's good to be able to name these literary devices, these tools. But it's also more important to me that you can just notice that a writer is doing something interesting, right? And it's more important to me that you can discuss that in your own words. It's more important to me that you could do that than you can name them specifically, right? That you perfectly know and can define every single term of literary devices. So before I get to the Ray Bradbury All Summer in a Day story, I want to show you a great example from one of my favorite books, We Were Liars. If you've read this book, you're going to recognize this passage from early on in the story because it's pretty striking. And if you haven't, I still think you'll be able to recognize a lot of the interesting things that the writer's doing here. That June, summer 15, Dad announced he was leaving and departed 2 days later. He told my mother he wasn't a Sinclair and couldn't try to be one any longer. He couldn't smile, couldn't lie, couldn't be part of that beautiful family and those beautiful houses. Couldn't, wouldn't. He had hired moving vans already. He'd rented a house, too. My father put a last suitcase into the back seat of the Mercedes. He was leaving Mommy with only the Saab, and started the engine. Then he pulled out a handgun and shot me in the chest. I was standing on the lawn, and I fell. The bullet hole opened wide, and my heart rolled out of my rib cage and down into a flower bed. Blood gushed rhythmically from my open wound, then from my eyes, my ears, my mouth. It tasted like salt and failure. The bright red shame of being unloved soaked the grass in front of our house, the bricks of the path, the steps to the porch. My heart spasmed among the peonies like a trout. Now, if you want to challenge yourself, you might want to pause the video here and see if you can predict some of the things I'm going to talk about. I think the first thing that stands out to most people when they read this is this moment here when the father pulls out a handgun and shoots the narrator in the chest. Those of you who've read the book, you know that obviously that's not true. And those of you using some uh, logic probably realize that this most likely didn't occur, as the narrator is still here telling us the story. And so this is a great example of hyperbole that we talked about on the last slide, this exaggeration. The father doesn't actually pull out the handgun and shoot the narrator in the chest, but by leaving like this, it felt that terrible, right? It felt like that kind of a betrayal. It felt almost violent what the father was doing. So it's very extreme kind of hyperbole here, but I think it gets something across. And we're drawn to it partially by just the hyperbole itself, the extreme violence of that image. We're also drawn to it a little bit by the way the writer suddenly turns into something that almost looks like a poem here, and our eyes actually visibly see something going on here. Blood coming from my open wound, then my eyes, my ears, my mouth. This kind of listing and breaking up the lines like this causes us to see it as being extra significant. Right after that, we get it tasted like salt and failure. So there's a simile, right? What does it taste like? It tastes like failure. The bright red shame of being unloved soaked the grass in front of our house. So that blood becomes a symbol of shame. There's kind of a metaphor there or a symbol. I want to also look at the beginning of this passage because I think it's quite important. Father couldn't smile, couldn't lie, couldn't be part of that beautiful family and those beautiful houses. Couldn't, wouldn't. Okay, another great little playing with sentence structure, drawing our eyes to it. And there is a bit of a parallelism here, but notice couldn't, wouldn't. Whereas in the paragraph before it says couldn't smile, couldn't lie, couldn't be a part of that family. Couldn't, wouldn't. So here the narrator is making a point. Father said he couldn't do this, couldn't do that. But she's saying, I realize he said he couldn't, but he actually wouldn't, meaning it was a choice. So we've noticed lots and lots of things here. Without being able to read more of it, we can't get too much into the theme, into the message yet, but I bet you can already start to get a sense of some key important aspects of the story, about telling the truth, for instance, about betrayal, right? Maybe some foreshadowing here about violence, and how will violence maybe play a part in the story in terms of its theme. There's a lot going on here. But like I said, without knowing the whole story, we can't do as much as we could if we had read the whole story. So that's why I want to look at this bit from All Summer in a Day. It's a shorter passage, but let's see what we notice here. Oh, but, Margot whispered, her eyes helpless. But this is the day. The scientists predict. They say. They know. The sun. All a joke, said the boy, and seized her roughly. Hey, everyone, let's put her in a closet before teacher comes. No, said Margot, falling back. They surged about her, caught her up, and bore her, protesting, and then pleading, and then crying, back into a tunnel, a room, a closet, where they slammed and locked the door. They stood looking at the door and saw it tremble from her beating and throwing herself against it. They heard her muffled cries. Then, smiling, they turned and went out and back down the tunnel just as the teacher arrived. Okay, I want you to start practicing your own ability to notice things that a writer's doing and then to put into words what you think they might mean. So, again, here, if you want to challenge yourself, see if you can predict some things I'll talk about. Okay, there's a few things that I noticed about this passage as a reader. Her eyes helpless is such a great phrase. Um, it's showing her sort of physically trying to get across the sense that she's helpless in this situation. She's whispering here, she's sort of stammering, but they say they know she can't complete her sentence. We really get a sense that in this situation she has absolutely no power here. She's vulnerable. And I think that's important to think about when we talk about the power dynamics in this story. Many of you guys noticed that the story is a lot about bullying and about the way we mistreat each other, um, and the way we sometimes maybe want to take power from people who seem different from us. So her eyes are helpless, and the boy comes and seizes her roughly. So there's some things we can notice there. And then this last section, I find it quite powerful the way um, Ray Bradbury suddenly builds this very kind of long sentence. They surged about her, caught her up, and bore her, protesting and then pleading and then crying, back into a tunnel, a room, a closet where they slammed and locked the door. It feels like it's kind of building on itself. And it goes from this boy who grabs her roughly to suddenly this nameless they, right? This mob, this group who are becoming sort of physical and surging about her. What surges? Well, electricity sometimes surges, and waves can surge. So this power that's being generated and that's picking her up and carrying her back further and further and further, and then they slam and lock the door. So that's some good noticing of some of the craft moves that Ray Bradbury is doing as an author. And now I want to show you just a sense of how you can try to write about it. This is where I want you to model your own work. Um, Look at this, writing about craft and theme. In this scene, Bradbury uses descriptive language to show how vulnerable Margot is, and he uses long sentences to show how the children have gotten swept up in their jealousy. So I start with a sentence that tries to get across the couple of things that I noticed just by looking at the passage carefully. And now I want to try to dig a little bit further. So I use this phrase like, this connects to the idea. Good. I want to go back to my first thoughts about this story. How does this connect to the idea that jealousy makes you blind to others? Well, because the children cannot see how much they're hurting Margot. The long sentence, they surged about her, and so on, shows them almost not knowing what they were doing. They're caught up in their own jealousy. This makes me realize that this story shows us that when you get caught up in your own pain, you can hurt other people. Bradbury uses descriptive language and long sentences to illustrate how out of control the children have become because of their jealousy. So, I've bolded a couple phrases that you don't have to use, but you want to pay attention to because they're the types of phrases you should use in your own writing. This connects to, causes me to go a little bit further in my thinking because, a simple word, but it asks us to go further in giving the reason for why we think something. This makes me realize that. That's another good phrase to push you to go a little bit further. And Bradbury uses, again, we're talking about author's craft, so we can point out the author himself or herself. What exactly are they doing, right? And then why are they doing it? He uses descriptive language and long sentences to illustrate how out of control the children have become. So this is a short blurb, but I think there's a lot in it that you can use as a model for your own work. And now it's your turn. This is step 3 in this sort of step-by-step manual we're creating, and it's paying attention to craft, looking for purposeful craft moves the author used and thinking about how they show you more about the thematic statement, right, in the story that you're reading. And your specific task after you've identified a passage is to write a third blurb or third free write using your close reading of the text to help you continue to refine or develop your ideas about theme. So you're going to want to find a passage in your story, just like I did with All Summer in a Day. And then at the bottom of your story, the third box called close reading, writing about craft, go ahead and copy paste the passage in the table, and then below that, write your own response to it as I did here. That's your job for today. Good luck to you. Talk to you soon.